There are many medieval ruins scattered throughout England, and the landscape is full of crumbling abbeys that were left to deteriorate after Henry VIII's reformation. But there are also quite a few little-known palaces that were once magnificent during the Middle Ages and were also discarded. Some were abandoned because of fire or war, and others just fell out of favour with their wealthy owners. Let's travel back in time now and visit some of these splendid buildings that have been lost to history. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Linlithgow Palace. This once majestic royal residence now stands ruined and roofless. Linlithgow can be found about 15 miles west of Edinburgh in West Lothian, Scotland. It has magnificent views standing on a small hill above a loch. The name Linlithgow means the loch in the damp hollow. The Romans originally occupied the site, and a royal residence could be found there from the beginning of the reign of the Scottish King David in 1124. Edward I of England invaded Scotland in 1296. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, he decided that Linlithgow would make a perfect military base, being halfway between the castles of Edinburgh and Stirling. Edward had the manor fortified, and in September of 1302, 140 women and 60 men helped to dig the ditches around the site. The men were paid 2 pence and the women 1 penny a day. In 1330, Linlithgow was retaken by the Scots for King Robert the Bruce. In 1424, after his return from captivity in England, it was the Stuart King James I who ordered work to begin on the rebuild to turn the building into a palace fit for Scottish royalty. Following this, his heirs continued the work to create an impressive palace, with James IV adding royal apartments and James V a 3-tiered courtyard fountain. The ill-fated Mary Queen of Scots was born at Linlithgow in 1542. In 1603, after the death of Elizabeth I, it was Mary's son James VI of Scotland and First of England who ruled Scotland and England together through the union of the crowns. However, the royal court was mostly based in England, and the unused Linlithgow fell into disrepair. The end came in 1746 when a fire ravaged the once majestic palace. Savoy Palace. During the Middle Ages, many noble palaces lay behind London's city walls. One of the most desirable locations for these noble houses was the Strand. With a frontage on the Thames River, the Strand was downstream and usually downwind of the stench and smoke of the city. In 1246, King Henry III gave the land between the Thames and the Strand to Peter, Count of Savoy, an uncle to his wife Queen Eleanor. In the medieval period, the palace was said to have been the grandest in London. The magnificent edifice was thought to have consisted of an inner courtyard surrounded by several buildings, including a chapel and cloister, stables, a bakehouse, a kitchen, and a famous rose garden. The palace was large enough to hold up to 150 knights and their retainers, along with hundreds of servants, financial clerks, and members of the clergy. Geoffrey Chaucer began to write the Canterbury Tales whilst he was a clerk at the Savoy. Later, the Savoy was gifted to Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, and eventually inherited by Prince John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III. John was one of the richest men in England, second only to his nephew, King Richard II. Rich and powerful men always attract enemies, and when the Peasants' Revolt began in 1381, Savoy Palace with its lavish ornaments, tapestries, and jewels became the focus of that hatred. The palace was systematically taken apart brick by the rioters, and what wasn't smashed was thrown into the Thames before the Savoy was burnt to the ground. Anyone found looting was said to have been killed by their fellow rioters. One story tells how 32 men drank themselves to death after being trapped in the cellar during the fire. The word Savoy is still linked to opulence, and the site of the palace is now home to the Grand Savoy Hotel and the Savoy Theatre. Palace of Winchester. Located within the parish of Suffolk, Winchester Palace was founded in the 12th century by the brother of King Stephen, Henry of Blois. As Bishop of Winchester, Henry was a major landowner, served as Chancellor to the King, and was in charge of the royal treasury. This meant that he needed to regularly attend both court and parliament, and he decided to build himself a grand palace in the city where he could stay when carrying out these duties. Other bishops also had episcopal palaces in London, such as Lambeth Palace, home to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Winchester's Great Hall was built around 1136 and enlarged in the 14th century when the rose window was added. Beneath the hall was an ornate vaulted cellar with direct access to a wharf on the River Thames for the transportation of supplies. The building, which was one of the most important in medieval London, had apartments arranged around 2 courtyards along with a garden, tennis court, a brewery, buttery, kitchen, butchery, and a prison. There were many ecclesiastical prisons maintained by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages that were used for the imprisonment of both clerics and laymen accused of crimes against the Church. The palace served as a venue for the wedding of King James I of Scotland to Joan Beaufort, who was the niece of the then Bishop Cardinal Henry Beaufort, in 1424. Winchester Palace remained in use until around 1700, when it was converted into warehouses and tenements. The Palace of Winchester was destroyed by fire in 1814. The remains of the Great Hall and the Rose Window can still be seen in Bankside, London. Bishop's Waltham Palace. In 904, King Edward the Elder, son of King Alfred, decided that he liked Denewulf, Bishop of Winchester's estate in Portchester, better than his manor house at Waltham in Hampshire, so he did a swap with the clergyman. From there, the land was passed down through the Winchester bishops. Then, in 1158, not content with just one magnificent palace, Henry de Blois, as a later bishop, decided to build another one. Being one of the richest churchmen in Europe, he was able to have the manor remodeled and extended. Cardinal Beaufort, half-brother of King Henry IV, often resided at Waltham Palace. He carried out further renovations and added an extra story to the west tower of his private apartments, a new chapel, and a new inner gatehouse and living areas. In his will, Beaufort left Queen Margaret of Anjou the, quote, blue bed of gold and damask at his palace of Waltham, in the room where the Queen used to lie where she was at that palace, and 3 suits of the arras hangings in the same room. In the 14th century, William of Wykeham, who was Chancellor to both King Edward III and Richard II, remodelled the palace with a new service area, kitchen, great hall, and a great chamber. Waltham Palace was popular with the royals. Henry V visited there, and both Henry VIII, who described it as a fair old house, and his eldest daughter Queen Mary I liked to stay at Waltham. Mary even visited there before her marriage to King Philip II of Spain at Winchester Cathedral. In 1644, the palace was destroyed during the English Civil War. It was held for the king by a garrison, but was surrendered to Cromwell's forces after a long siege. The then Bishop Walter Curll was said to have escaped the palace in a dung cart. It is thought to have been set on fire, as it was reported by a royalist supporter that Waltham House was in ashes. Clarendon Palace. Clarendon Forest in Wiltshire, England was probably used as a royal hunting ground in the early Middle Ages, and by 1130 a hunting lodge had been built on the site. At first, the lodge had a freestanding great hall, chapel, and wine cellar, but it was extended during the reign of King John and again by Henry II and Henry III, which resulted in a much larger building. Richard II even added a dancing chamber. In 1164, Henry II, in an attempt to limit papal power and restrict ecclesiastical privilege, announced the constitutions of Clarendon whilst at the palace. The fallout from this resulted in one of the most infamous murders in English history, the death of Archbishop Thomas A. Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. By 1252, Queen Eleanor of Provence, wife to King Henry III, had a chapel, 3 chambers, a wardrobe, and a suite of apartments at Clarendon over 2 floors. In the Queen's Hall was an imposing fireplace with double marble columns and a carved over mantel. The windows of her rooms were glazed, some with figured glass. The chapel on the upper floor had a marble altar and was painted with scenes from the life of St. Catherine. It was at Clarendon that King Henry VI first started to show signs of insanity in 1453. By 1500, the buildings were no longer being maintained, and by the Civil War, the palace was in ruins. Palace of Placentia. There had been a royal manor house at Greenwich from the reign of King Edward I in the 13th century. Also known as Greenwich Palace, this royal residence was built in 1443 by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Meant as an escape from the chaos of the City of London, the building was designed simply for entertainment and pleasure, and was originally named Bella Court. Humphrey was regent to his nephew, King Henry VI, but when they had a falling out and Humphrey was arrested for high treason, like many medieval nobles, he died in prison under mysterious circumstances. Then it was Margaret of Anjou, the king's wife, who inherited Bella Court. The house then became known as the Palace of Placentia, or the Palace of Plaisance. Between the years of 1498 and 1504, Henry VII had the palace redeveloped and transformed it into London's leading royal residence. With state apartments and a chapel all built around 3 large courtyards, the once small manor house now became home to famous monarchs. Henry VIII and his daughters Mary I and Elizabeth I were all born at Placentia. As king, Henry VIII continued the renovations, building forges, stables, armories, and a new banqueting hall. He held huge parties, banquets, and jousts there. The lavish Christmas feast of 1516 is remembered as the first masquerade party ever held in England. It was at one of the jousts held at Placentia that the king was thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours. He never joust again. It was also in the grounds of Placentia that Sir Walter Raleigh threw his cloak over a puddle so that his beloved Queen Elizabeth could walk over it and not get her feet wet. The palace was the principal residence for both King James I and Charles I, but once Oliver Cromwell took control of the country during the English Civil War, it fell into disrepair. Cromwell made a failed attempt at selling Placentia, but with no takers he transformed the building into a biscuit factory and a prisoner of war camp. Two environments that naturally go together well. The Palace of Placentia was demolished in the 17th century, and the site was used to construct Greenwich Hospital in 1694. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a great week. Cheers!